这个也要管吗？我孩子都成这样了，我还不能说点什么吗？是不是啊？你笑什么？有什么好笑的？好笑吗？
What you're seeing now happened last night, July 20th, in front of the e-commerce public service center in Maiji district, Tianshui, Gansu. Parents from the Heshitu Peishin kindergarten rushed here overnight to defend their rights after their children were found with lead poisoning. They were live streaming on the spot. As we all know, at 8 p.m. last night, the joint investigation team, supervised by the State Council, released the latest report on the lead poisoning case. The report was over 6,000 words long, but clearly these parents were not satisfied with it. That's why they came here overnight to protest.
不要说，你看啊，我敢站在这，我跟大家敢说，我们这来是干啥的？维权来的。但是呢，我们现在堵路。这有个问题啊，他们为啥平白无故打人抓人了？是你们抓人了，抓人！你这行政其实有一个家长在来的2月7月2号做的，来的2月做的也是22。7月4号在中心医院做的177，7月10号在华西医院做的189，咋回事？
Some parents started live streaming with their phones, but during the stream, their accounts suddenly disappeared. A typical example of how things work in China. Since the joint investigation report came out last night, I've read it several times. And here are a few of my thoughts. First, the core facts haven't changed. Back on July 8th, Tianshui authorities released an initial report, and many people found it hard to believe. I mean, how much money can you really save by buying industrial materials? Feeding that to kids is just unbelievable. Even the kindergarten teachers and the principal were reportedly poisoned. So some people suspected the problem didn't come from inside the kindergarten, but from the outside. There's a lead zinc transfer station about 1.8 kilometers away. Some believed that heavy metal processing there might have polluted the soil or groundwater and spread to the kindergarten. Others brought up a case from 2006, when a local factory polluted surface water in Tianshui, which also caused lead poisoning among children. So naturally, people began to wonder, is this environmental pollution again? Some believe the local government is trying to cover it up, pushing all the blame onto the kindergarten principal to avoid taking responsibility and to hide a bigger environmental issue. The new report says this: the lead zinc station did stop operations back in 2015. Now it only stores lead and zinc ingots. Samples taken from soil and groundwater showed that its environmental impact was minimal, and the polluted site from 2006 had already gone through soil remediation. So, the report says, those sources are not the cause. So what's the real cause? According to the report, the principal of Heshitu Peishin kindergarten, Zhu Mulan, was eager to enroll more kids. She asked the kitchen staff to make colourful food to attract children and parents. At first, they used food-grade colouring, but it didn't look vibrant enough. Later, 2 kitchen workers bought industrial dyes online, with Zhu's approval and also with consent from the investor Li Mufang. They used the dyes on food about 6 times a month, and even ate it themselves. As a result, the principal's blood lead level was found to be 169. She's now in jail and likely receiving medical treatment. So what does this tell us? These people were shockingly ignorant. They had zero food safety awareness. Even if the industrial dye packaging said not for consumption, they still used it. Anyone with basic knowledge would know. If it's not food grade, you can't give it to kids. You can't even eat it yourself. That's the first point, ignorance. The second point is how seriously the authorities are treating this. Tianshui's party secretary, mayor, district leaders, and even the heads of the provincial health commission and testing centers have all been placed under investigation. At Gansu Tianshui Second People's Hospital, 5 people, including the hospital president, vice president, and 3 staff from the testing department, have also been placed under investigation. The entire hospital has now been taken over by Gansu Provincial People's Hospital. Their party secretary has come in to take over as the new party head here. And over 30 medical experts have been sent in to directly manage the hospital. In other words, Tianshui Second Hospital is basically finished. This kind of strong response is rare in similar public incidents. In the past, when something like this happened, the public would often say it ends with a few toasts of punishment wine, meaning some symbolic gestures and a few scapegoats. But this time, almost everyone involved is being held accountable. And when the disciplinary commission starts a formal investigation like this, it usually leads to criminal charges. There are two main types of charges. For those at Tianshui Second Hospital, it's called dereliction of duty. For the city leaders, the party secretary and mayor of Tianshui, it's failure of oversight. Both could face serious criminal consequences. That's the second point. Now let's talk about the third one. In the July 8th statement, some things weren't very clear. I talked about this in my second episode. They said 251 children were tested. In the end, 233 had excessive blood lead levels. Only 18 were normal. They mentioned these results were from multiple medical institutions, but didn't say which ones. Clearly, this included results from Xi'an, because many parents took their kids there after getting suspicious about the local tests. So the report actually combined test results from both hospitals, but mainly based the conclusions on the Xi'an results. What does that mean? It means the original tests in Tianshui were unreliable, and in fact, way off. People felt the gap was too big to make sense. And now, the new report explains why. At Tianshui Second People's Hospital, test results were deliberately altered. A blood lead level of over 400 micrograms per litre was changed to 103. Another one, originally 292, was lowered to just over 40, which brought it into the normal range. From July 2nd to 3rd, during mass testing at Peishan Kindergarten, the Provincial Health Commission had sent 6 experts to collect samples. But even that process was manipulated. After drawing the blood, they let the samples sit for 2 hours and 40 minutes. This allowed the red blood cells and plasma to separate. Then they only collected the top layer, the plasma, which naturally showed much lower lead levels. So this latest report finally gives a clear explanation for the previous distorted data. But like I said in episode 2, with the Chinese Communist Party's investigation reports, what they tell you is usually true, but never the whole truth. And this time is no exception. Is this new report the full truth? Definitely not. So today, based on the same logic I explained before, I'll break down this third State Council investigation report. What facts they told us, what they didn't, and where they blurred the lines. Here's my conclusion up front. The lead poisoning case in Tianshui is a major public health incident, deliberately covered up by local officials through negligence and misconduct. Now let me explain why I believe that. The latest investigation report states that the kitchen at Heshitu Peishan Kindergarten purchased industrial food dyes on 2 separate occasions. The first purchase was on April 23rd, 2024, and the second one took place on February 20th, 2025. They bought 1,200 grams of yellow dye, 1,000 grams of red, and 900 grams of green. All 3 types contained lead, and among them, the yellow dye had the highest concentration, roughly 20% lead. The report goes on to say that, starting from May 2024, the dyes were used in food preparation around 6 times per month on average. But here's where it gets interesting. Why report an average? Why not just list the actual usage for each month from May 2024 until now? Why hide behind an average of 6 times per month? In my opinion, this so-called average may not reflect the real usage pattern. It might not be a true average at all. Let me explain why I think that. On February 20th, 2025, they made another purchase, a second batch. Now, what exactly did they buy again? I believe it was the yellow dye. Why? Because of what was left over. According to the investigation, only 57 grams of yellow dye remained. That means, out of more than 1,100 grams, almost everything had been used. Meanwhile, the red dye still had 458 grams left, and the green dye had 444 grams remaining. so clearly the red and green dyes hadn't even been fully used by February. But the yellow dye, it was completely used up, restocked in February, and mostly used again, with only a small amount left by the time of inspection. This tells us something important. After the second purchase, after February 20th, 2025, the frequency and amount of yellow dye used likely increased. In fact, I believe the usage during the spring of 2025 was much heavier than in the latter half of 2024. Now let's look at the testing results. Besides the 251 children still attending the kindergarten, the investigation team also tested 72 children who had left the school in 2024. Among those 72, only 5 showed elevated blood lead levels. The rest were normal. This group of children had likely consumed dyed food for at least 2 to 3 months, since the first purchase was back in April 2024. Some of them might have left the kindergarten in July, some perhaps in September. But even those who left in July had consumed the food for 2 months. And still, most of them were not affected. That suggests the level of lead exposure in 2024 was relatively low, or at least lower than in 2025. Now let's talk about the test result tampering at Tianshui Second People's Hospital. 2 cases were changed in a very suspicious way. One child's blood lead level was originally 292 micrograms per litre. It was lowered to just 42.37. Another case was changed from 440 to 103. Those are not small adjustments. They completely change the meaning of the results. Now let's focus on a key date, May 1st, 2024. That's when the first lead poisoning case was officially detected. Think about it. The kindergarten purchased the first batch of industrial dye on April 23rd. That's just 8 days before the first elevated result. This shows the dye was used right away and the health impact appeared very quickly. We don't know exactly which case was detected first, but I believe it was likely one of the lower numbers, possibly the cases with 176 or 161 micrograms per litre. In any case, the hospital didn't take it seriously at the time. They didn't treat it as an urgent problem, and so the opportunity to stop the harm early was lost, and that's how the cover-up began. Later, around May and June of this year, more and more children started showing symptoms. Many parents took their kids to Tianshui Second People's Hospital for testing. Suddenly, the blood lead levels were extremely high, unusually high. At that point, the hospital began to panic. That's when they started altering the results. Notice the 2 test results they changed. One was 292, the other was 440, the 2 highest readings at the time. Why did they change these? Because by then, rumors were already spreading among parents. People were starting to suspect something was wrong at Peishin Kindergarten. To prevent panic, the hospital tampered with the numbers and made them look normal. They wanted to calm the parents down and avoid a scene. That's the only possible reason. There's another detail worth noting. One of the children was tested not once, but 6 times in total. The first test was in November 2024, and the result was already high, 251 micrograms per litre. After that, the child was tested 5 more times. All 5 results showed excessive blood lead levels, yet no one at the hospital took it seriously. Now think about this. That first reading, 251, was already high enough to require treatment. So it's very likely that the child did receive treatment. But even after treatment, the lead levels remained high. 5 tests in a row still showed abnormal results, and the hospital still didn't act. This is a serious failure. Even more troubling, the investigation report doesn't mention anything about this child receiving treatment. But logically, they must have. You don't see a result like 251 and just do nothing. So what did Tianshui Second People's Hospital actually do? If we say they were engaging in criminal behavior, that's not an exaggeration. Then, as more children's lead levels continued to rise in May and June, the authorities finally realized something was wrong. The hospital reported the situation to the city's party committee and government. Now here's where the political part comes in. On June 21st, Tianshui was hosting a major event, the Fuxi Grand Ceremony. It was a big deal. Gansu province gave it a lot of attention. Even Ma Ying-jeou, the former president of Taiwan, attended. Top provincial leaders, the party secretary and the governor, were also present. This was seen as a political priority. Nothing was allowed to go wrong during the event. So during that period, everything else was put on hold. The local government didn't want any bad news to surface. But once the ceremony ended on June 21st, and more abnormal test results came in, they started to panic. By July 1st, someone supposedly reported the case to the police. But as I mentioned in my previous episode, I believe that report was staged. It was fake. On July 1st, law enforcement officers arrived at Peishin Kindergarten. They began searching the premises immediately. That very night, one of the kitchen staff was already trying to hide the food dye. What does that tell us? It shows that by the time officials came on July 1st, the investigation was already focused on the kindergarten's kitchen. But here's something the report doesn't clearly say. When exactly were the food samples collected? Was it on the night of July 1st? I don't think so. In my opinion, the sampling must have happened before that date. Why? Because by July 1st, authorities already knew that at least 2 food samples from the kitchen had dangerous levels of lead. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone straight to the kitchen for a targeted search, and the cooks wouldn't have tried to hide the dyes. So, as I said in my last episode, the claim that someone called the police on July 1st, and that's what triggered the investigation, is complete nonsense. In reality, the local government had already realized that this was a serious food safety incident. According to China's emergency regulations for major food safety events, such incidents must be reported to the local government within 2 hours. Then, the local government must report it to the provincial authorities within another 2 hours. And the provincial government must report it to the state council as soon as possible. Now, consider this. There were 251 children involved at Peishin Kindergarten, and no one knows how long they had been consuming the contaminated food. Under Chinese law, if more than 100 people are affected by a food poisoning case, it qualifies as a major food safety incident. And for a case like that, high-ranking officials, including the local party secretary and the mayor, can be held accountable. So by July 1st, the local leaders in Tianshui likely already understood the seriousness of what they were dealing with. They reported it immediately to the Gansu Provincial Health Commission. That's why, on July 2nd, the Health Commission sent 6 experts to the scene. This kind of quick response only happens when a case reaches the threshold of a major incident. If this had been seen as a minor issue, they wouldn't have mobilized such a response. But what happened next is very telling. On July 2nd, these experts from the Provincial Health Commission started collecting samples from the children at Peishin Kindergarten, and that's when the manipulation began. During the sampling process, they let the blood sit for 2 hours and 40 minutes before analyzing it. That delay allowed the red blood cells and plasma to separate. They only collected the top layer, the plasma, which gives much lower lead readings. This method was clearly intended to reduce the numbers. Now, the investigation report also includes a few technical terms that are worth explaining. It says that during the testing process, the team did not perform sample spiking, parallel testing, or retesting of outliers. So what do those terms mean? Sample spiking means adding a known concentration of a substance, a standard, to the samples before testing. Why is this important? Because it helps ensure that the test process is reliable. If the added standard gives the expected result, it proves that the equipment and method are accurate. It also helps catch errors in sample collection or environmental conditions. But in this case, the team from the Gansu Health Commission didn't do any of that. That's the first major problem. Second, there was no parallel testing. So, what is parallel testing? When you collect a blood sample, you're supposed to divide it into 2 parts, sample A and sample B. If B shows an abnormal result, for example, blood lead levels exceeding 100, you must retest it. Only if both A and B show consistent results can the data be considered valid. But in this case, parallel testing was not done at all. Third, there was no retesting of outliers. That means if a result looked suspiciously high, or low, it should have been rechecked. This is a basic procedure in any proper testing process. But none of these 3 procedures were followed by the Gansu Provincial Health Commission team. No spiked samples, no parallel tests, no outlier verification. So what does that suggest? It suggests that these experts didn't simply overlook protocol. They acted deliberately. They intentionally let the blood samples sit for 2 hours and 40 minutes before testing. They intentionally skipped the basic steps that ensure accuracy. They intentionally tried to make the test results appear lower than they were. Now this raises a big question. Who told them to do this? According to the findings in the Joint Investigation Report, this kind of action couldn't have happened without instruction from higher authorities. It's almost certain that the Tianshui City Party Secretary and the mayor were behind this. Why? because both of them have already been placed under formal investigation. And what are they being investigated for? Negligence of duty. This is the likely point where they failed to do what they should have, and instead tried to hide the truth. But what about the Gansu Health Commission experts? Why would they cooperate in this cover-up? Because they also had something to lose. If the true number of affected children, more than 100, was reported to the central government, they too would face accountability. You see, by law, once a public health incident affects over 100 people, it becomes a major public health emergency. If that happens, the chain of responsibility extends from the local government all the way to the provincial health authorities. So both the Tianshui city leadership and the Gansu Provincial Health Commission had a strong motivation: keep the official number low. If the number of affected children could be kept under 50, it would be classified as a general incident, not a major one. That's why the two parties worked together. And this kind of cover-up needs technical help. It needs expertise. So the experts from the Provincial Health Department used their skills to suppress the data. They delayed testing. They skipped procedures. And in the end, out of 251 samples, the vast majority came back normal. Roughly 90% showed safe lead levels, at least on paper. And interestingly, even now, the joint investigation report still hasn't told us how many of the 251 children actually tested over the safe limit. How many were officially recorded as unqualified? That data remains hidden. But my guess, the number was deliberately kept under 50, to avoid triggering a major incident classification. Now you can see how this worked. It was a coordinated effort between local government and provincial health officials. Even the two altered results from Tianshui Second People's Hospital, the ones changed from 292 and 440 to lower numbers, were likely modified before July 1st. And why? Because city officials probably gave the order. They didn't want such high numbers circulating. If parents found out just how high these blood lead levels really were, panic would have spread instantly. They needed to calm the public, make it seem like things were under control. So, on July 1st, they began to quietly manage the story. By July 3rd, they held a meeting with the parents. They said, "Don't worry, most of the test results are normal." That's what the parents were told. And that's how they tried to keep the situation under control. But things didn't go as planned. The parents, worried and distrustful of the test results from Tianshui, decided to take matters into their own hands. Starting the night of July 3rd, large numbers of parents rushed to Xi'an overnight with their children. They went to Xi'an Central Hospital for retesting. When the results came out, the difference was shocking. Compared to the Tianshui results, the levels were 10 to 20 times higher. The truth that had been hidden finally came to light, and the entire cover-up collapsed. That's how the truth about the Tianshui lead poisoning scandal was ultimately exposed. The sequence of decisions, manipulations, and attempts to control the narrative was never fully explained in the official investigation report. But based on the timeline and actions, this is most likely what really happened. Now that we've walked through the entire incident, there are a few reflections I'd like to share. First, the kindergarten principal and the kitchen staff acted with unbelievable ignorance. If they had even the most basic understanding of food safety or science, this wouldn't have happened. As I mentioned in the first episode, in many remote regions of China, education levels are still very low. We've had cases like the melamine-tainted milk and the big-headed baby scandal. Anyone who works in food service should know by now. Banned additives should never be used in food preparation. But in places like Tianshui, many people simply don't know. The backwardness here isn't just economic, it's informational and educational. The cooks in this case clearly hadn't gone through any professional training or safety certification. In fact, let me add something else. The July 8th investigation report claimed that Peishin Kindergarten had obtained official enrollment approval in 2022. But the July 20th report contradicted that, saying the kindergarten never had a legal license to operate. So what does that tell us? It's reasonable to assume that the kitchen staff likely didn't have any proper professional qualifications either. Without licenses or training, they simply didn't understand what they were doing. And that's how such foolish decisions were made. That's the first point. Second, the report still hasn't revealed the full chemical composition of the dyes. As we mentioned in the second episode, many suspect the yellow dye used was chrome yellow, which can contain up to 60% lead. But the report claims the yellow dye in this case had only 20% lead. That doesn't match. So what's the explanation? Either it really was chrome yellow, but had been mixed with filler materials to dilute the lead content, or it was another yellow pigment that still contained lead, but in a different chemical form. We still don't know. And it's not just the yellow dye. The red and green ones haven't been identified either. We only know they also contained lead. Red pigments often include lead compounds, like red lead oxide or vermilion, but again, we don't know what was actually used here. Because the chemical formulas of these dyes were never made public, we have no way of knowing whether these children were poisoned by other heavy metals besides lead. Why weren't the full compositions disclosed? I believe it's because the authorities were afraid of causing even greater panic. If the dyes also contained chromium, or worse, other toxic elements, the parents would have been furious. And the public outcry might have escalated further. This is one of the most critical gaps in the current investigation report. Third, the latest investigation report states that 6 individuals have now been formally arrested. Among them are the kindergarten's principal and the investor, Ms. Li Mufang, along with 4 kitchen staff. In addition, 2 other individuals were placed under criminal detention and 3 more were released on bail pending trial. Compared to the July 8th report, that's 1 more person added to the list. Back then, the report said 8 people had been detained and 2 were on bail. Now the question is, who is this extra person? Was someone added directly under bail supervision? Or did one of the previously detained individuals get reclassified under bail and another newly detained? We don't know. But the key point here is this. Who exactly are these 5 individuals who are now under criminal measures for producing and selling toxic and harmful food? Their names and roles haven't been made public, and that's very suspicious. Given the charges, they must have had a direct connection to the kindergarten operation. So why not publish their identities? Could one of them be someone who sold industrial dyes online, like chrome yellow? Maybe that person didn't have a license to sell such chemicals, and that's why they were arrested. It's possible. But the report says nothing. By hiding these details, the investigation leaves room for doubt and speculation. And that's not how a public health crisis should be handled. Now, one final point I want to make. From the very beginning, I said the people working at this kindergarten, the principal and the kitchen staff, were incredibly ignorant. If they had even a little basic knowledge of food safety or chemistry, they wouldn't have made such disastrous decisions. But here's the thing. Ordinary citizens and small business owners, even if they're uneducated, still have the right to be ignorant. We can't expect everyone to have expert knowledge of science or toxicology. That's why we have government oversight. It is the job of the government to act as the final line of defense, to protect the public, even when someone else makes a foolish mistake. But in this case, every level of that defense failed. Take Tianshui Second People's Hospital, for example. One child was tested 6 times over nearly a year. Every result showed elevated lead levels, even during treatment. And still, the hospital failed to recognize the seriousness. That's not ignorance anymore. That's willful negligence. That's evil. If they had any conscience at all, they would have sounded the alarm. Worse still, they falsified data. They changed a result of over 400 micrograms to just 103. Imagine being a parent and seeing 103 on your child's report. You'd think everything was under control and probably wouldn't seek treatment. Another child's result was changed from 292 to 43. A number so low it wouldn't even trigger medical intervention. What happened to that child's health? No one cared. They weren't thinking about the kids. They were only thinking about protecting themselves from accountability. And that's not ignorance. That's evil. And what about the Gansu Provincial Health Commission? They were directly involved in testing 251 children, and they too manipulated the data. If the kindergarten staff were foolish, then everyone else involved, from the city's party secretary and mayor, to the health commission officials, to the hospital testing teams, they were not just negligent, they were morally corrupt. They knowingly and deliberately put children's lives at risk to save their own careers. If the problem had only been the ignorance of the kindergarten staff, this incident might not have turned into such a serious disaster. The damage may still have occurred, but likely not to this scale. What truly made this situation so severe was the combination of 2 factors: the ignorance of those running the kindergarten and the deliberate wrongdoing of the local government. including both enforcement bodies and decision-making departments. Take a look at the timeline. On July 2nd, experts from the Gansu Provincial Health Commission arrived at the kindergarten. Then, on July 4th, 3 experts from the National Health Commission were sent to the scene. In my view, this was the real turning point. These national-level experts likely noticed inconsistencies in the testing process or in the data being reported. They may have realized the situation was far more serious than it appeared and reported it directly to the State Council. That's what led to the launch of a higher-level investigation. The report released on July 8th clearly had problems. The public could see it. Parents could see it. But somehow, the original investigation team insisted everything was normal. Only after the case was escalated to the central level did the truth begin to surface and reveal something much bigger. This leads to a deeper issue. The system's ability to correct its own mistakes is very fragile. As long as local leaders, a party secretary, a mayor, senior health officials decide to cover something up together, every local oversight mechanism fails. If the State Council hadn't intervened, this case might have been buried entirely. Even if parents saw through the fake data, what could they have done? They had no real way to resist or hold anyone accountable. But we also have to ask, can every incident like this in China be escalated to the State Council? Obviously not. Most can't. So what about the other cases that don't get that level of attention? Without central intervention, will the truth ever come out? And if a case eventually involves people at the central level, who will investigate them? There's no higher body. The United Nations can't step in. The World Health Organization has no authority inside China. Back during the SARS outbreak, when WHO tried to investigate, ambulances in Beijing were ordered to drive sick patients around the city to avoid detection. So relying on step-by-step escalation to solve these problems is not reliable. There's always a ceiling. And if the highest level is compromised, then there is simply no one left to hold them accountable. That's the heart of the issue. This is not just about incompetence. It's about a system that allowed ignorance and corruption to work hand in hand. And when those two things combine, when people who don't know better are protected by those who do, but choose to lie, the result is what we've seen here. That's all I wanted to share today. Thank you.
不要说，我敢站在这，我跟他们讲说，我们这来是干啥的？维权来的。但是呢，我们现在主诉。是你们先打人的，你们先打人的，是你们先打人的。
说得，
我不站，我不想站，我不想站，我不要站。爸爸，我。